How's everyone doing? I want to talk a little bit about coping and how to develop coping skills and mechanisms, and how these types of what we call interventions can be important within the world of sport, but also within an organizational context in terms of the sport management environment. When you think about coping, to some extent there's a common sense idea or definition associated with it. Now, taking that common sense definition and understanding one step further, what becomes really important here is teaching people how to manage and understand things that are going on internally and externally within their lives, within their situations, so on and so forth. And there's different ways of focusing on, and we talk about coping mechanisms, and the reason we talk about coping mechanisms is because there's two basic typologies. One is a strategy and one's going to be much more of a style. Okay. Now, a strategy, there's two types of major strategies. One is focusing, really what it sounds like, on the problem, and the other one is focusing on the emotions that are generated from the exogenous external stimuli. Now, in terms of a coping style, there's different approaches. One is to kind of meet it head on and develop a plan and explicitly articulate what to do. And the other is to try to avoid, to some extent, everything that's going on. Now, this is just kind of an example that I found in the world of sport from a journal article, especially within the world of sports psychology. And I think it's interesting is understanding how people cope with a variety of different things, be it internal, external stimuli, those emotions that sometimes we have that are unique to us. To some extent, you can develop a prescription for that. In terms of developing strategies and that kind of thing. But also, to some extent, there's a sense of one-on-one and having to work with the individual and get a sense for not only their normal, unique, personality-based disposition, but also the things of what's going on in their environment, especially if we're talking about from a competitive point of view, how they're able to historically manage those things or not be able to manage them, and then also how to identify goals of how to deal with these things in the future. So as you can see over here, this is just kind of a nice example to show you kind of how complicated things can get. Oftentimes, we're looking for a coping style or some sort of coping mechanism it's very easy, sort of simple, cut and dry, and it just doesn't normally work that way. Okay, now we're dealing with coping, especially when you're talking about athletes in the competitive environment. They usually do a couple different things that we talked about before. You can approach it or you can avoid it. And we're not necessarily saying one is better or worse than the other. But within that, if you decide I'm going to approach this head on, how are you going to deal with it? Are you going to have much more of a kind of task-oriented problem-solving approach, or are you going to focus more on emotional management? And now if you're going to avoid, and avoidance is more than just la 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 la, it's not happening, okay? But within both of those, you have to more or less have one, a clear plan of what you want to do, but you can't necessarily have that plan until you've attempted to look at the individual and understand how the individual normally addresses different types of stressors or stimuli in their environment. Alright, we've talked about before this notion of something being dynamic. And if something's dynamic, then it means it has a sense of fluidity and movement, and it's constantly evolving and changing. Okay, and that's a very, very important word to use when talking about coping styles or strategies, because when you start looking at understanding a sense of dynamism, the environment is going to be very, very unique, and therefore it's going to require a sense of adaptability and evolution and constant evaluation and reevaluation. Well, the same thing is true for the person. As we talked about before, you have different, you have your basic personality, and then the moods and emotions that you're going to fluctuate. Those things are going to be very, very dynamic. Well, the dispositional hypothesis, which is essentially where we originally started, basically is talking about the athlete having these ways of coping with stress and whatnot. Either they have them intuitively contained within them, and this is something that occurs naturally, or they've been able to take these prescriptive, almost note cards, as it were, from a therapist or a sports psychologist and be able to deal with it. And as a result, the dispositional hypothesis is focusing on the consistent process. The idea, the disposition of the individual can be greatly structured by this whole notion of something, a structured, consistent environment. The dynamic hypothesis is kind of the opposite. You know, the first one talking about something being is or ain't, a black and white issue. The dynamic hypothesis is much more fluid. It's much more based upon unique attributes of individuals and factors, and the relatively social nature of all these things that occur. Let's say you have a a contest, and you're watching a football game, and it's a very close contest, and let's say maybe it's a high school football game, and there's a lot going on, right? There's a lot at stake. You got two really good teams. Maybe there's a berth in the state playoffs or something like that on the line. And so as you're going throughout that, what happens if one of those players has a neck injury and is down on the field for 15-20 minutes? Okay, that is a very, very unique and very specific thing that happened to that game, that event. All right? And so if you've learned specific ways of dealing with stress and coping with whatever adversity is going on in the situation, the idea is that that process is set in stone. Well, you, without a doubt, have probably not built in the loophole of what happens when you have a player who has a dramatic neck injury that's down on the field for 15-20 minutes. There's no prescription necessarily developed for that. And so research over the last 20-25 years has really identified that this dynamic hypothesis tends to be the more realistic within sports psychology. Now, it's not saying that we don't want to do some of the things that the dispositional hypothesis stresses, and that's trying to expand on the intuitive dynamics of the individual. Some people are just naturally laid back and they don't really get stressed, and you want to promote that and try to keep that whole state of mind going in a stressful athletic situation. But there are some things that we can do, that we can learn, that we can teach. Just realize, just because you can teach something doesn't mean that the athletes are going to have all of the mechanisms available to them all the time, because the situations just don't work that way. Some of the things that, as we're trying to develop these coping mechanisms, these are some of the constants. These are some of the things that we've identified. And you can see Smith in 1999 talked about these factors. Well, these factors are the things that tend to be consistently proven by years and years of both clinical and applied research, dealing with athletes on a variety of different levels, professional, elite, amateur, collegiate, scholastic, youth sports, that kind of thing. But then also, these coping mechanisms are not unique to one type of player, one type of sport, that kind of thing. Right? And so if you'll notice that as we go through these, you'll see that these things are almost kind of like a theory, in that they're very, very broad and abstract. And the reason they're abstract is that it helps to explain the process of coping. But if you get too specific, then the specificity then relates primarily to one athlete, one dynamic. Okay? So some of these that Smith identified: recognition of stimulus generality, meaning, hey, what's going on out there? Just give me the basics of the stimulus that's going on, that's going to influence the environment and then subsequently me. A broad application of a coping skill, realizing that you've heard about this stimulus, maybe crowd excitement, and you're able to, as an athlete, deal with all of the excitement of playing at home, that kind of thing. And that kind of bleeds nicely into the personal significance. Now, what we mean by personal significance is not necessarily that the person is utilizing it, because we know that's most likely going to happen, but how much significance, important, does the individual place upon it. And then if they place a high level of importance, then we know it's going to be more molded and folded into what they do on a day-to-day basis. The internal locus of control, remember what we're talking about there is that the causality, really, that the individual has impact on everything that's going on around. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to blame themselves for every single thing that goes on, but in terms of what they have available to them because of who they are and what they've learned, they've been able to internalize how to deal with both the good and the bad types of stressors that are going to be out there in a competitive environment. Also learned resourcefulness. What does that actually mean? Well, primarily what we're looking at is that you've learned different techniques and strategies that have helped in the past. And what you've also learned is that these techniques and strategies, these mechanisms, don't necessarily cure everything. It's not like a panacea that if you're nervous and I do this, this, and this, if I tie my shoelaces a certain way and I wear this type of wristband and I put the eye black under my eyes in this order, that I'm necessarily always going to be ready and raring to go. You have to realize that these processes are just that. It's a process, but process by its very nature are subject to change. Other things, and this is where you start getting into some very, very unique things, is that generally speaking, and this is not always, and it's not like men or women cope better with things, but because of the social nature of gender roles and scripts and things like that, males and females and athletes at various levels, they tend to cope with things differently. Again, we're not saying that one is better and worse than the other, and we're not saying that men should be more like women and women should be more like men, but there are distinct differences. A match between stressor and a coping strategy, meaning good stress, maybe you're going to react a certain way. Bad stress, remember we had the eustress and the distress, the different types of stress out there. Something negative happens in your match or in your game or anything like that, and so you're going to deal with it this way. Dealing with success and adversity are not the same thing. Therefore, the process for coping is not going to be the same. Utilizing an approach coping strategy, meaning we're doing what? We're starting to look at things, understand the problem, understand the issue, and realize that we're going to approach it, head it, kind of hit it face on, instead of trying to circumvent that. Avoid the stressor in the future. Identify the stress, realize how it impacts you, how it impacts the offense, for example, and then realize how that impacts the defense or the special teams, if we're talking about football, for example, and realize how that impacts the team, the coaching staff, how the plays are going to be called. A kind of a holistic approach. That's what's going to be important here. And then finally, this whole idea of self-determination and or intrinsic motivation. Again, the impetus is on the individual and being able to go out and decide that, or the individual has some decision over how to approach success or failure in a game. The individual has the ability to go out and self-motivate in terms of being better for not only themselves but also for the team. Those that don't necessarily have that ability or are sort of lower, remember the spectrum of external or extrinsic motivation, those people that are lower on that spectrum and have to be motivated by the exogenous structures and sources tend to have, I don't want to say worse or faulty coping mechanisms, but their coping mechanisms tend to not be nearly as impactful for them. And what I mean by impact is, again, this whole idea of success, maximization of athletic performance, that kind of thing. One of the things that sports psychologists spend a long time doing is focusing on the elite athlete. And that kind of makes sense because if you look at the top and you understand the people that are at the top, then you can understand the process by which they were able to kind of quote-unquote climb that mountain. And then you can teach that process to others so that they can be successful. Well, in kind of keeping with that idea, this whole idea of an approach style tends to be very, very common for elite athletes. Meaning, we're not going to pretend this is not an issue, this isn't a problem, and we're not going to necessarily avoid it. If you think about the death of a teammate, all right, to deny that it actually happened, obviously is not productive, it's not mentally healthy anyway. But as you go through those stages of grief, how do you deal with that as an athlete? How do you deal with that as a team? And how does that impact their performance? And there's a lot of different factors that are involved with that. And so, when something terrible happens, we want to look to that. You look to those individuals. Think about, how did the New Orleans Saints deal with Hurricane Katrina? And you talk about the Hornets and any kind of professional or collegiate franchise that was involved or impacted by Hurricane Katrina. How do they deal with those types of things? And so as you start getting into understanding more about those kind of head-on approach styles of coping, there's a couple of different things. Psychological training, the physical training, and how those two things tend to go together, the types of strategies that you're going to develop, and then also how you employ them. And somatic relaxation is literally, remember we talked about many times before how the body can, because of these sort of psychological stimuli or things like that that are out in the environment, the body actually has an impact from these things. You know, when you talk about expectation, and we can talk about and we can define expectations, but expectations are the byproduct of social environment. All right, it's nothing in the air, it's nothing in the ground. But even though we're talking about social expectations, those expectations can actually literally influence the body, and that's what we're talking about there, is trying to have the mind have power over the body so that you can start the relaxation process and coping with whatever's going on. Self-talk is one of those very kind of interesting things, and there's the definition there. I don't necessarily need to read it verbatim for you, but it's the individual oftentimes literally out loud talking to themselves. And they do this as a way of motivating, as a way of refocusing, centering, and as a way of dealing with whatever success or failure that they just had. And one of the things about modern sport especially is that there are multiple social environments that happen, multiple venues, opportunities for success and failure. And so how do you deal with success and how do you deal with your failure? When you're talking about where is self-talk going to be done? Well, most of the time it's going to take place in the competition, but how it's seen or how it's viewed by others, that really just kind of depends upon the individual. And also, one of the things that's really important too is that usually by skilled athletes. And what do we mean by that? Someone who has a very, very complex mechanistic, kinesthetic activity that they're going to be involved with. Okay, swinging a golf club, very complicated. Now, it's not better or worse than an offensive tackle. Trying to get their footing right, their hands together, and then understanding how to block someone, that kind of thing. But if you're talking about maybe a guard and it's on a running plane, okay, I'm going to pull to my left, I'm going to take 2 steps, and I'm going to try to get my body in and shift your weight so that the guy in front of you, you're trying to turn them just a fraction of an inch. That's a very, very important thing. Okay, we're not trying to denigrate or impugn that. But those people that have to go through a very, very complicated skill, we've talked about divers before, and you're going to execute something of that magnitude and that skill level, tend to utilize something like self-talk a little bit more. When is it going to take place? Before, during the competition. Again, we've talked about, as I sort of just mentioned, oftentimes maybe used a little bit more by the individual sport athletes, and the reason is, a golfer or a diver, something like that. They have coaches, yes, but oftentimes those coaches aren't necessarily involved with them at that moment during the contest. A tennis player does, the coach is going to be in the stands, and that, if we're talking about a professional tennis player. And so coaching is very important to those individual sport athletes, but it tends to happen before or after a contest, not as much as the team sports. Also, in team sports, you tend to have much more of a social environment there, and so people are supporting you, saying, hey, come on, Mark, shake it off, it's okay. You don't necessarily have to do that completely yourself. Oftentimes you have team leaders. You have those sociometric stars, as they're called, those people that take it upon themselves to help collectively manage individual emotions. Well, if you're an individual sport athlete, you don't necessarily have that, so therefore you have to pick up that slack. What is self-talk? I mean, we see the definition there. But it's something short, sweet, and to the point. And it's almost like a mantra, or a very, very short one. And it oftentimes includes these key words. All right? And these keywords are related to a specific skill oftentimes. All right? What that skill is oftentimes is up to the individual, up to the coach to instill it in the individual, that kind of thing. And it usually involves something that maybe the individual was struggling with, or whatever, you can imagine. Now, as we start getting into understanding the actual types, there are 3 basic categories. Okay, one is task-specific statements. All right, things that oftentimes relate to that mechanistic activity, and by mentioning it, as you're kind of talking to yourself, saying, make sure I do this and that, focus on this, get your left foot ready, whatever. As you're doing that, it's a verbal articulation that you're going through the process of focusing and trying to center. and you utilize, instead of some sort of thing in the environment, you're utilizing the activity in and of itself to focus. The other one's encouragement. You know, let's say you're a defensive back, a cornerback that just gave up a long pass. You clap your hands, you're like, all right, we'll get him next time. And you're literally talking to yourself. Now, as we said before, well, most of the time this happens with individual sport athletes. And I like the idea of a cornerback, because oftentimes they talk about, well, you know, Revis Island and that kind of thing. You're talking about that person being out there on an island by themselves, and there's a sense of, you know, oneness and competition. I have you, you have me, now let's go from there. And it tends to, at times, resemble that dynamic of a head-to-head, like two wrestlers going at it or something like that. Mood words also is another one. You know, and it can be anything, whatever that mood and that word and how they've come together, how it relates to that particular individual. And I put the last one on there, profanity, because, you know, social psychologically, profanity has become much more acceptable in modern culture, especially here in American culture. And so as a result, oftentimes these words, which have, you know, the profane connotation to them, within the realm of athletics, actually become very important. You know, they help to encapsulate the mood of the individual, help in terms of encouragement, and help exemplify how important the task-specific statement needs to be. Okay, it's not saying that, you know, profanity always has to be in there. Okay, I'm just talking about how these mood words, it's really up to the individuals. If you're an individual that profanity is very important, or is just kind of very, very common to you, then maybe it might be included in it. Or if you're someone where profanity is not normally involved in your basic speech patterns, then because it is involved in whatever your mood word is or your mood phrase is, that kind of thing, then maybe it really highlights the importance to you. It's one of those things that there's not a ton of research out there on it, so we're just sort of spitballing and hypothesizing here. But the idea is that these mood words help you kind of get into that moment and help with not just the self-talk process, but helping to relate that self-talk to what it is that you're doing. The other thing I'd like to say is that all three of these things tend to work together. All right? It's not like you're just going to use one over the other or anything like that. You know, it depends upon what's going on in the game, where you are in the match or the contest or whatever. Sometimes they can be very, very helpful. Now, like I said, not everyone is going to utilize these things. But those that do, this tends to be very, it's short, sweet, and to the point, and it's related to something. You know, usually, like we talked about, you know, there's sort of a natural rhythm and timing to a lot of athletics and a lot of the physical skills that are to be accomplished and completed. And so that, you know, when you think about boxing, you know, there's a lot of rhythm there. I don't know if you box, but you know, you played around with it, and you've got, you know, work on your heavy bag and your speed bag, anything like that, and footwork is very, very important to it, and there's a sense of fluidity. And if you've ever worked a heavy bag, you know, just to go in there and swing away and punch, it doesn't do anything. I mean, it does. You're hitting the big bag, and it's moving a little bit, and okay, fine. But there's an understanding of leverage. There's an understanding of how the body moves and how it approaches things. And if you've ever tried to work a speed bag, if you don't have that rhythm and you don't have that timing, then it's just a hot mess. You know, that little thing is flying around all over the place, and you can't really get a nice workout. Think of like jumping rope. Once you get into that rhythm, okay, and that sense of rhythm and timing, that's what self-talk is trying to essentially replicate. It's trying to get your mind and your body back into being in sync and in coordination and simpatico again. The thing that's kind of interesting about this is, you know, because it is brief, because it is so simple, phonetically simple, you don't want, you know, large multisyllabic words that you're going to be necessarily sort of preaching to yourself. But when all these things are done, and it's done in accordance with the activity or something like that, then it tends to be much more successful. And like I said before, self-talk is not something everyone's going to be involved with. Sometimes you may do it, sometimes you don't. And maybe it changes year after year, or maybe you didn't self-talk for the first 5 years of your career, and then all of a sudden it's something that you've developed over time. Again, we are human beings. We tend to evolve. Therefore, our coping mechanisms are going to evolve with us based upon who we are and where we are and the types of organizations that we're going to be embedded. Why do you do it? I mean, they always say talking to yourself isn't a problem. It's when you start answering yourself that you tend to be a little bit more psychotic and have that break. There's a lot of different reasons why you could do it. Because some people like that verbal articulation. It's a sense of structure and routine. Other people, it sort of reminds them of what a coach might say, and they feel like they're kind of almost coaching themselves. And so there is, a cognitive component to it. It's reminding you of the skill that you need to execute, and it's reminding you how to go about do that. But as we talked about, as you move up with elite athletes, you kind of have this. Your body has already been trained. It's been honed. You know what your skills are. And so as you start to move up, that motivational component becomes much more important. So we know that it can become important, therefore that's why some people use it. But how do you really institute that why with someone who's never used it before? How do you sort of convince them that this is something that's going to be good for them? Well, this whole idea, remember, self-efficacy is the fodder notion that you can actually complete a task the way it needs to be completed to be successful. And what you try to do early on, and I see this oftentimes with the guys I know that coach youth football, is there's a sense of relating sort of universal words, language, things like that, to the development of skills early on. And so as a result, because they're learning these skills early on, they're associating these words, these sort of momentum, motivational words that relate to a skill or a specific task. They do that early on, and that's something that later coaches can sort of expand upon. It helps people initially, helps them to understand that they can do it and they can accomplish the skill, whatever it is that they're trying to do. Well, as that starts to change, as the skill becomes something you're very, very good with, you don't necessarily need the little phrase to remind you, then what it can do is actually help to address the mood. You fail on the field, something happened. This can be something to say, okay, that play just ended, or maybe had a bad couple plays, a bad series or something like that, and you want to make sure that it's ended, it's done. This is a way of sort of cleansing the palate. Remember, watch people that taste wine, and they'll smell it and they'll take a little sip and then they'll drink water, right? Because they're cleaning the palate, starting over again. And what that then does is helps hit the reset button and start altering the mood. All right? And one of the things that's so great about sport is that we talk about momentum and the highs and the lows of some sort of competitive game or event. You can be on top of the world in one moment, and then at the complete and utter bottom in another. And it's that change, and that's one of the things that people like, is this constant battle to evaluate whatever's going on around you and to battle those emotional aspects, those internal demons, that kind of thing. And so as you're addressing the mood, the emotion, those things are going to change. It also can be something that helps with effort. All right, and the last two are dealing with a little bit more about motivation. And one way of really greatly increasing the effort is by helping with that last point there about focusing and centering. Okay, those people that tend to be more focused then can focus on this notion of motivation, and these can be specific, what we call heuristic devices that help with that centering or attention-based process. Relaxation. And this kind of comes out of basic psychology right here. Once anxiety starts to increase, all right, the only way that you can stop this, and it's like a train, and once that train gets chugging, the only way that you can do that really is by reducing tension. And that's what these procedures are supposed to be doing. They help with trying to decrease the somatic anxiety and the physiological response, help with the centering and focus and the mood and emotional management of the individual, which will further decrease the global sense of anxiety and stress. These are a couple of things that I don't want to say you have to have, but in terms of the effectiveness to maximize that relaxation-based process and response out of the individual, these are going to be some things that you need. I don't know if you've ever done this, And if you have, then you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, then maybe I might sound like a quack who's just doing a bunch of weird stuff and sort of this, I'm up here talking about relaxing and centering and that kind of thing. But deep breathing is one. And one of the things that we do know is that as you intake air and oxygen comes into your system, that oxygen then is processed by the body and sent out to the muscles. All right, that's where explosion in the muscle sense starts. All right, and whenever you have rapid breathing, all right, and if you've ever seen someone who, they're so nervous and their breathing becomes very, very shallow, and because it's so shallow, they're not getting a lot of air in. They need to take more breaths per minute to get the same amount of air into the body. Well, that's fine, but once you start doing that, you take more and more and more and more, and that anxiety stress spiral starts to increase. Part of that increase is due to the fact that the individual is starting to work themselves up by breathing constantly. These short bursts of air that they're taking in, it's increasing the anxiety. All right. So one of the things you try to do is you try, especially that abdominal breathing right there, that stuff from the lower part of the torso. And they talk about the abdominal breathing. One of the things is it's lower, so it's a much more elongated process. It's slower, which means if you're focusing on your breathing, you're not focusing on the external stimulus or stimuli. Therefore, you're already starting to decrease anxiety because of just focusing on the breathing aspect. Also, breathing from the abdominal area is what we call a wet breath. All right, it's moist because as air comes up through the body and it comes down through the body, all right, it travels more, and it's going to be influenced by the sinus cavities and the mucous membranes and things like that. Well, a wet breath is one that is the byproduct of an elongated process. And in those people that are into singing or opera and things like that, you know what I'm talking about here. You want to use that abdominal breathing whenever you're performing, right? One, it allows for control of anxiety, and then two, it actually allows for a better type of air to go over the vocal cords, and so you can project at a greater sense, right? Well, and while the projection and the air going over the vocal cords and all that kind of stuff is very important, what I'm really interested in is that idea that it helps with the performance aspect. And the reason it does is, again, it starts to slow the body down. You slow the body down, then you start slowing the mind down. Progressive relaxation. This is one of the things that if you've ever done it, I've always heard it. You start at the bottom of your body, where you tense all the muscles. So you start with your feet and your toes, and you work up your calves and tense your leg muscles, and up through your core, then up into your upper body and then your upper limbs, and even getting into those muscles surrounding your neck and on your head and that kind of thing. All right. As you start to do that, then you relax it. And the funny thing is that if you contract a muscle and then relax it, you have this sense of relief that starts to pervade the body. Now, hormones, I don't want to get too much into physiology here, but the hormone system, the endocrine system, and all that kind of stuff, works by dumping these hormones into the system, the bloodstream, based upon muscle contractions and reactions to, the body's reaction to external stimuli. So, oh my God, there's someone coming at me, it's runner test who's charging me in the stands. I'm going to get nervous. Then the adrenal glands dump adrenaline into the system. My muscles start to tense, and then I can react. Well, once that's passed and my muscles start to relax, then I can start to relax, because the sort of subconscious assumption here is that as the body relaxes, that means you're out of harm's way or stress, and then the mind can start to relax afterwards. Meditation. This one, using a couple different things. One, it says an athlete uncritically focuses attention on a single thought, sound, or object, and you're like, well, how can you focus uncritically? Have you ever stared at something to the point that you don't even really see it anymore, and you're just kind of staring for the sake of staring? That's starting getting into a meditative state. Now, sometimes, if you've ever noticed, in different types of meditation or yoga and things like that, you're going to use a mental device or a mantra. Sometimes it can actually be out loud. Some people in yoga actually use various sort of what we perceive to be guttural grunts, but it's the use of of the body and the mind and sound to sort of highlight where we are in the process in terms of achieving a meditative state. Now, what you can do, there's lots of different things. One of the things that I've done in the past is I like palm trees. I don't know why. I dig them, from the desert, not a lot of trees anyway, no water to speak of, So the palm tree has sort of become something to me is just kind of a pretty cool thing. It's just kind of laid back. It's like a Corona commercial or something. You're in a state of relaxation, and you're just kind of all the day's stress is just starting to flow away. And if you notice, and nobody ever comes to my office, and that's fine, but I've got this crappy little picture of, that's right, a palm tree sitting right up there on my thing, because it's just something that you see, and it just, for me, it kind of reminds me of a de-stressed or a less stressful environment. And oftentimes what you can do with an athlete is before, especially if they get anxiety really, really bad, especially primarily before an event or something like that. But I've seen it. The way I've actually been involved with it is athletes, student athletes who get very, very worked up over taking an exam. It was kind of that student athlete role that they were struggling with. And so, you can actually see people that take their deep breath and they just kind of close their eyes for a second, or they think about something, and they're sort of entering into this meditative state so that they can then start accessing that long-term memory storage system. Biofeedback is exactly what it sounds like. You're using, physiological or medical instruments to help control responses from the body. All right, and so someone's talking. You have something that's measuring your heart rate. And so as you hear and you see that your heart rate's high, then you try to do things so that you can control that number and start to lower it. You can do that with skin temperature. I've heard about it with the skin temperature. I've never actually seen it. It's not to say it doesn't exist, obviously. The biofeedback strategy is a little bit more obviously time and labor intensive, and you have to have an infrastructure there. If you're dealing with high school athletes, maybe this is not necessarily, you're not going to have those instruments, those devices available to you. The thing that's kind of interesting is realizing, and as we go on, you would develop a comfort level with certain strategies, in terms of trying to relax or energize someone. And I think probably the most important thing here is realizing that, like my little palm tree, that doesn't work for everyone all the time. Okay? Like I've said a million times, there's really no prescription. There's no little card that I can give you that tells you how to do this, how to motivate every employee, how to relax, as we're talking now, every employee that you're going to deal with. To some extent, you need to know the process. And the reason you know the process is so that then you can do this, the matching hypothesis and intervention. The idea that you can identify that this person needs to be relaxed or needs to develop a coping mechanism for this particular stimulus or set of stimuli, and then you can tell them, hey, these are some things I think that might help you, and help lead that person to some sort of successful resolution that's going to impact not only their performance but also hopefully the collective performance. Okay, so you have the individual and then you have the team. Team energizing things. This is things that we're probably a little bit more intuitive with. If you think about, think about your personal experience with team sports. Some of you have had it, some of you haven't. But goal setting. Oftentimes, what you do is you set a goal for the entire team. Now, how does that impact the performance? Because you're looking to impact the performance of the individual, obviously, because that's essentially how the machine is going to roll on, is by the individual parts moving well. But they have to move well in relationship to each other. So that growth needs to be relative. You don't want someone far exceeding the growth of the rest of the team, because that does not necessarily mean that the team is going to do well. Okay? Oftentimes you hear about bulletin board material. Someone who said something, somebody rolled out a tweet, and someone got a hold of it, and so they're going to post that so everyone can do it, or they're going to retweet it so everyone on the team can see it, and that's going to. And when you're talking about energizing strategies for a team, a lot of this also depends on what size team we're talking about. And if you're a high school basketball team, and like a varsity team, you have 15, 17 individuals on your team, that's fine. You're going to utilize a different strategy. If you're the head coach of an FBS team, and you have 85 players on scholarship, well, you're going to use probably something different. All right. Individual energizing strategies. You know, what you're going to do is you're going to try to blend these two things together. We need to talk about them in isolation so you really understand them, but you're going to blend these. You're going to identify individuals in the collective environment, and you're going to help to motivate that individual. Phil Jackson, former coach of the Lakers and the Bulls and things like that, he was sort of the master of this. They called him the Zen master. And this, one of the things that when Shaquille O'Neal was there, Phil Jackson would, like every couple of weeks, he would put a different book in Shaq's locker. And you remember that one point, the really unfortunate name that sort of nickname that Shaq self-appointed. He called himself the Big Aristotle. You're like, okay, it's unfortunate. It didn't really stick necessarily, but it was a byproduct of some of the ancient Greek philosophical works that Phil Jackson was actually having Shaq read. You know, in season, off season, that kind of thing. And so what he was trying to do is he would motivate the individual in one way, and then he would motivate the team in another way. Okay? And when you're focusing on the individual, there's a lot of different things you can do. You know, the self-talk. One of the things you really, really want to do is understand the connection between attention, focus, and motivation. And so you're going to try to get individuals to focus on a variety of things, focus on the process, focus on some mechanistic activity in terms of being, you know, in the contest or in the game. Imagery oftentimes works in terms of, you know, different types of relaxation strategies. Also, you hear, you know, elite athletes talk about they see themselves going through. I visualize myself swinging and hitting the golf ball a certain way. I visualize myself going through a pole vault or throwing the discus or you know, something that's very, very complicated like that. You visualize yourself. You visualize yourself going to the free throw line and that kind of thing. Okay, these are things that, again, what you do is you identify the need within the individual. You tailor some sort of energizing strategy to that individual. And then you're going to have a different set of strategies that you're going to utilize in the larger team environment. If all goes well, you've motivated the individual, you've helped to relax them and help them to focus their attention so that each individual then can maximize their performance, do their job, as they say, and then that entire collectivity is able to go out and perform at an optimum level. All of this, and the reason I really like talking about this, all of this stuff, managing and controlling these stressors and these things like that, you're doing that so that you can help people achieve goals. You do that so that the performance of the entire team is going to be at an optimum level so that you can achieve goals. And so all this, you know, up to this point we've been talking about a lot of different things, and goal setting is one of those things that we'll get into, and it's sort of the culmination of understanding a lot of psychological jargon for both the individual and the team, and understand how, you know, stress and motivation interact with the individual. And we talk about the interactionism paradigm where the individual is going to interact with their environment, and you do a lot of that so that you can better set the individual to understand how to achieve and meet goals. And so we'll talk about that later.